you're watching Gearz, brought to you by O'Reilly Auto Parts. Better parts, better prices every day.
You know, it's a historical fact that Pontiac is credited with starting the whole muscle car war in the 1960s. When John DeLorean told his guys to put a big engine into a mid-sized car and call it the GTO, man, the whole automotive world changed forever. And that is why most gearheads have a soft spot in their heart for Pontiacs. Of course, there was a black Trans Am that helped with that too, but that's a completely different story. The point here is, anytime we can roll in a Pontiac and mess with it, we do it. Case in point, this really clean 66 Le Mans. Now, as you can see, this car is in really good shape, and it should be. The owner has spent a ton of time and money on this thing over the years. Really, all it needs now is just some final hookups. But before we do anything to this car, we need to show you what makes this car so special. And to do that, we need to go back a few years. Dennis Veach was a hot rodder through and through. And growing up, he always had a fast car around, so he could show off for the girls. But there was one particular girl and one particular car that caught his eye early on. The girl's name was Angie. The car was a 66 Pontiac Le Mans. And he not only managed to find both of them, but he somehow persuaded Angie to marry him in the Le Mans.
Dennis, you may kiss your bride.
Oh, yeah!
Now, if that's not true love, I don't know what is.
When you're young and you start out not having a lot of money, you try to be inventive. He was a visionary and always had fun, cool ideas like that.
As the years passed and the family grew, the Le Mans was always there. Not always in the best of shape, but there. Did you ever want to get rid of it?
No, oh no. Okay. He never entertained the idea of getting rid of that car. And it was not a GTO, and because everybody talks about the the GOAT, and he wanted something just pure.
Then one day, a few years ago, Dennis decided it was time to get serious about the car. He had some time, he had some money socked away, and he wanted to finally do it right. So a serious restoration was started.
When we moved from Indiana, he sold all of his racing stuff, so we had sprint cars and probably every kind of race car you could think of, and he sold it all with the idea that he was going to use that money to put in and do a proper restoration of his beloved car.
The front and rear suspension was completely rebuilt and the brakes were upgraded. An LS engine with all the goodies and accessories was dropped in place of the stock Pontiac engine to up the performance and bring modern fuel injection into the picture.
Every day he drove an hour and a half to work on this car. Now, you don't usually send pictures of the other woman back to your wife.
The body was stripped to bare metal, smoothed out, and repainted with a classic Pontiac blue, and a white vinyl top adds the crowning touch. The interior was planned out, new gauges were put in, and everything was moving forward to final completion when things suddenly took a turn in the worst possible way. Dennis died, and suddenly the dream was over. But it wasn't over for Angie, and it wasn't a dream anymore, because Dennis's death left her with a partially finished car and boxes of parts laying in a garage with no way of knowing what she had, what had been done to the car, what still needed to be done, nothing. And the reason is because Dennis was like a lot of car guys. He didn't talk about what he was doing in the garage a lot, and he didn't keep accurate records of what he had.
Out of all of the things that Dennis told me, whether it was his love for me or his love for his children, what he wanted his children to have when he passed, he always told me that, but he never told me what he went and done with the car. I don't know if the speedometer worked, if the gas gauges worked, is it safe to take to a car show? I just didn't know what I needed to do, but that was the first direction I took, was just to try to get a safety check on it.
Fortunately, Dennis and Angie were members of Gearz Nation, which allows us to be able to come in, finish up the car, and help Angie assess what she's got so she can then decide what she wants to do with it. Also, since a lot of people now are looking for barn finds or unfinished projects, it's important that you, number one, know how to assess a project like this, and number two, know how to keep your project from becoming an undocumented burden on your spouse should something happen to you. Wow. Starting in the garage, we're going to dig through the boxes and loose parts to see what we've got. A lot of stuff. And identifying the parts is usually pretty self-explanatory.
For a Chevy. Those are in the wrong garage.
However, in a garage with this much history, you can pretty much figure you're going to run into some stuff that you have never seen before.
I don't know about you. When's the last time you saw speakers that big?
Fortunately, a quick Google search and a little bit of detective work
Hope these things don't roll on me.
will usually unravel most mysteries pretty quickly.
These look like door panels up here.
Make sure that you keep a detailed list of the parts you find and their condition, whether you plan on selling them or not.
I have bumpers for this car. You know, I have the original gauges. I have so much of this stuff, and I know that some of it is valuable, some of it's probably not.
Okay, now we are ready to move on to the car itself. And figuring out what has been done to a vehicle is a lot more involved than digging through a bunch of boxes, because there's usually a bunch of receipts and paperwork and junk thrown all over the place that you need to figure out, which is exactly why I wrote the project planning book, to eliminate all this crap, all of this confusion. So we're going to transfer all of the pertinent information and part numbers from the receipts, the notes, the business cards, etc., and put them in the proper place in the planning book. Hey, welcome back to Gearz, where today we are talking about a subject that nobody wants to talk about. And that is, what do you do when a death or a divorce or some other kind of calamity leaves you with a project that's not finished? Now, the reason this is important is that most of the barn finds and project vehicles that we're going to find these days fall into one of these categories. Case in point, this 66 Le Mans that the owner was deep into a restoration on when he passed away, leaving a non-running project for his family. So today we're showing you how to go through a project like this, decipher what has been done, what still needs to be done, and also show you how to get it running, get it roadworthy, so you, or in this case the family, can decide what they want to do with this project.
Hope these things don't roll on me.
Now, so far, we've gone through and organized and inventoried the boxes of spare parts and all the paperwork. Now it's time to dig into the actual mechanicals of the old Pontiac. All right, on a project like this that was undergoing a complete restoration with numerous modifications, you've got no choice but to check the whole thing out, every nut and bolt, so you know what's been done. So, with it up on a lift, we're going to start at the bottom and check all the suspension components, the steering and the brakes, to make sure everything is properly assembled and bolted down. Now, as we do this, all the components will be listed in their proper place in the planning book. Also, be on the lookout for any leaks or drips, because even new seals and gaskets can go bad after sitting for a while. Now, based on how clean the undercarriage is, it was no surprise to find that all the suspension components are brand new and just need some final adjustment. However, we did find a few missing cotter pins and tie rods and ball joints that hadn't been greased yet. The next step under the car is to check the fuel lines and the gas tank, since those are usually overlooked. But not in this case. As you can see, Dennis was pretty thorough. So we'll move on to check the new LS drivetrain motor mounts and the cross member to make sure everything's bolted in and adjusted properly. Okay, the next step is a big one, because you need to drain and replace all of the fluids in the vehicle. I'm talking engine oil, transmission, gasoline, brake fluid, coolant, everything. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, man, you don't need to do all that. Yeah, you do, because all of these fluids go bad over time, and since there's no way of knowing how old they are or how they've been used, it's just cheap insurance to go ahead and replace them now. The next step brings us up under the hood, where we can check out the radiator and the hoses and all the other accessories to make sure that everything is mounted properly and there's no big surprises. Now, you need to take your time here and check things out carefully, because some things are going to be pretty obvious, others not so obvious. For example, take a look at this air conditioning unit. You can see that it's not hooked up, and there's no condenser up here, there's no plumbing, there's a lot missing, pretty obvious. But if you'll notice the driver's side header, 2 of the plug wires are laying right down on the header, which is going to give you a nice stinky surprise when you go to start this thing. Now that's a simple fix. All you do is put on some aftermarket plug wires, but now's the time to find it, not after you start the engine. Hey, welcome back to Gearz, and our jump start of the '66 Pontiac Le Mans that was left sitting unfinished when the owner passed away. A more common problem than more people think. Now, as you can see, a lot of time and money has been spent on this car, but the owner's the only one that knew what had been done. So we're helping out the family by getting it running, getting it roadworthy so they can enjoy it. We're also doing a complete evaluation of it so they know what they've got should they decide to sell it. Now, so far, we've gone through the suspension, checked out the frame, did the plumbing, looked at all the steering, the brakes, all of that. Then we moved up under the hood, changed all the fluids, checked the engine wiring, checked all the accessories, and now the car's running. So now we're going to move on to the wiring and the interior. The first stop is the trunk, and as you can see, it is really, really nice in here. There is no rust, there's no damage. This is a solid car. All we really need to do is put in some sound deadening, put in the trunk mat, that'll finish up the floor. Then for the wiring, you just need to look it over, make sure it's all in good shape, make sure it's going to the proper place. Now, speaking of wiring, I see one problem that has got to be addressed, and that brings up this.
Now, quick tip. Brought to you by E3 Spark Plugs. Born to burn.
Most people know that moving the battery out of the engine compartment is a good thing because it gives you more room up front and it puts weight in the back of the car. But if you do decide to relocate the battery, you need to remember 2 things. Number 1, it has to be accessible, and number 2, it has to be securely mounted. And if you don't do these 2 things, you end up with a battery that's probably not going to be serviceable and potentially dangerous if it's just bouncing around. For example, the first time you try to replace this battery or jumpstart this car, you're going to realize that this is not a good place for the battery because you can't get to it and it's not securely mounted. The best solution to this is to get some sort of battery box or hold down and mount your battery here on the passenger side in the trunk. That way it's still easily accessible and the extra weight helps with traction. This is where most muscle cars have their batteries. Now, if you still don't want to see this battery box, at this point it's very easy to build a removable panel that mounts under the fender and goes all the way down to the floor and completely hides this area. If you'd like to learn more tips to make your life easier in the shop, check out the tips page on the website. Okay, the next stop is the interior wiring. And just like under the hood or in the trunk, there's just a lot of little things that Dennis didn't quite get to. Now, we already checked the gauges when we started the engine. Those all work, so that's good. And you know Dennis was a big sound guy, so he put a stereo in, and it comes on, but there's no sound out of the speaker, so we're going to have to check that out. Then, of course, none of the temperature controls work, none of the air conditioning, the turn signals, the headlights, the windshield wipers, none of that's hooked up. Now, according to the paperwork, Dennis installed a painless wiring harness in this thing, and as you can see, here's part of it right here. So what we need to do is figure out what's been hooked up, what hasn't been, and that's just going to take some time. The final step is body and panel fitment. Now, since this is usually the last thing you do when you're building a project, this is where you're going to find some of your biggest issues on an unfinished project.
And now, Gauge Tech. Brought to you by Stuart Warner. We were there when it all began.
You know, most people know that pulling out an old wiring harness and replacing it with a new one will solve a multitude of problems. But even if you do that, there is still one problem that remains: wiring up the individual gauges. Because once you get up under the dash with the tools in your face and bad lighting, getting wires to those gauges is almost impossible. Fortunately, there's a solution to this. This is a harness from Painless made specifically for wiring up gauges. Now what you do is just set out your gauges how you want them on your workbench where you have plenty of light, plenty of room, and then you just wire up your gauges. Then when you're done, you mark the ends, install your gauges, then just make your connections and plug that into your main wiring harness. If you're going to be using any kind of aftermarket gauge, that is the way to wire them up.
And now, Paint Tech. Brought to you by Wizards Products. Make it shine.
You know, once a vehicle comes back from the paint shop is when a lot of people say the real work starts. Because fitting doors and body panels can be very time-consuming, and it can be frustrating. But knowing some of the tricks to fitting body panels can make this job a lot easier. So we are going to walk through the basic approach to fitting doors and body panels so you can get your vehicle looking as good as possible. Now, the key to lining up a car is knowing where to start. And you always want to start on a permanent place on the body that you know isn't going to move. So on this car, it's going to be the quarter panel, the rocker, and the roof. Those aren't going to move. Then get your door in place and you start setting your gaps. Now, while you're adjusting the gaps, you also need to be adjusting the contour of the door. If you look down the side here, you'll notice that the bottom of this door sticks out a little bit. So that needs to be adjusted in. It's a little low here, so the door needs to come up, and the gaps need to stay uniform. So you can see there is a lot going on here. Okay, once the doors are lined up, then you move on to the fenders. And once you get them in place, you set the gap back here at the door first. You get it loosely bolted up here at the grill. Then you add the other ingredient, the hood. And this is where the dance starts, because now you've got a whole bunch of gaps that you're trying to set all at the same time. Back at the hood with the cowl, that needs to be adjusted. If the hood comes forward, the grill needs to be adjusted. If the hood has to go sideways, the fenders have to be adjusted. Everything has to be moved until you get everything exactly right. Then you might find out you got a gap back here at the door that has to be changed, which starts the whole process over again. And you'll find out why most people don't want to do this. Then, once you have the body adjusted, just finish it up by doing the bumpers and the trim. Now, I know this is a lot of work, but once you finish and you step back and you see how good it looks, you're going to realize that all that work was worth it. And that finishes up our 66 Le Mans project. What started out as a confusing bunch of parts on an unfinished project brought on by the death of the owner is now a running, driving car that can be driven or sold depending on what the family wants to do. But if they do decide to get rid of it, all of the documentation of what's been done to this car is right here in the planning book, just like Dennis would have wanted it.
What are you working on? Brought to you by Woodward Fabrication, selling quality metalworking equipment since 1966.
Today's What Are You Working On comes from Chris Challoner, and he was looking for a big military deuce-and-a-half truck. What he found A 1972 International Scout. That alone is cool. Now, he said that the truck had been hacked on by the local mechanical genius, so the wiring was butchered and a lot of other things. So we pulled all that out, replaced that, and went through the mechanicals to get it safe to drive. Then he tore into the suspension. And when the smoke cleared, the Scout was sitting on 7 inches of lift and 31-inch tall tires. Man, that truck looks good. Fortunately, the body was in good shape. So Chris had it repainted, and check this out. A World War II fighter vibe, which just looks awesome on that Scout. I like the Spitfire angle, and I really like those big teeth on that front tire. Now, obviously, Chris still has a few things to finish up on the vehicle, like the interior, but you can see he definitely already has a one-of-a-kind Scout. So, Chris, to recognize such a cool project, we hooked up with our buddies at Woodward Fab. We're going to give you one of these shears so you can cut some metal. We're also going to give you one of these project planning books so you can keep track of everything that you did on that project. We're going to give you an O'Reilly's gift card to help soften the blow when you need to buy some parts. And since we know you like World War II aircraft, we're going to give you one of our Sergeant Rock packages with the die cast, the shirt, and the guitar picks. Now, for the rest of you guys, if you want to get in on this, get your project featured on the show, you got to go to the website, go to Gearz Nation, and submit your project. We don't care what it is. We don't care if it's done. It just needs to be something that you're working on. Also, don't forget to check us out on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that social media, because we've always got something cool going on there too. All right, that finishes up today. You need to get out there and work on something. We'll see you next time.